Alright, today we are back with another Final Fantasy VII news roundup where we'll take a look at sales updates for Remake Intergrade's multi-platform release, the PC lighting changes headed to Rebirth on PlayStation 5, and we'll preview a brand new and rather interesting event that will be celebrating the Ever Crisis 2.5-year anniversary, an event that could have implication on 7 Remake Part 3's story. So, let's talk about it. Alright, so we start off first with updates to Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade's multi-platform performance because now we have actual chart updates, which is super cool. And this is coming to us from Matt Piscatella, who is one of the heads of Circana. And Circana, for those of you who don't know, track a lot of sales data for video games, electronics, like headphones, even backpacks to a degree. And they do it by sales data. And they've been doing this for a pretty long time. So while it's not actual numbers sold, they usually follow the dollar amount. So it ends up being pretty accurate. And according to them, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade was the 9th best-selling game of January. Its previous spot, number 225. So it jumped like 216 spots purely because of its release on Switch 2 and Xbox. And again, this takes into account physical and digital sales, which is pretty cool. And again, since it's based on dollar sales, it usually ends up being pretty accurate. Now, if we look at Switch sales, I believe Remake was the second best-selling Switch 2 game of January. So a lot of people are getting their hands on this game, seemingly enjoying it, and I think the good word of mouth has provided that it has some legs. So more and more people are jumping aboard the 7 Remake Trilogy hype train. The more the better. If you're out there playing it for the first time, I hope people are enjoying it. It really is a fun game. I have a lot of great memories with Remake and where I was at that time in my life. I remember like every individual chapter, what I had for that meal for dinner that day, and my memory is pretty terrible. But to see Remake still performing incredibly well is super sick. Now up next, we move over to a really cool announcement, and that is the PC lighting upgrades that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth received are going to be making their way to the PlayStation 5. And we have a write-up directly from Naoki Hamaguchi over on Twitter where he writes, to coincide with the launch of Rebirth on Switch 2 and Xbox, we're preparing an update that adds streamlined progression features to the PS5 and PC versions. The PS5 version will also incorporate the lighting improvements previously added on PC. Across the 7 Remake series, our goal is to offer a consistent experience on every platform, and we'll continue working to ensure players can enjoy the game comfortably wherever they choose to play. Now, as far as the streamlined progression goes, again, I think this is cool. I think it's fine. There are a lot of people that, for whatever reason, don't like it. They feel like it shouldn't be an option. But again, I feel like this is a way for a lot of people to jump on board, play the game for the first time. Maybe they want to do multiple playthroughs. It's an accessibility thing as well. And I think we got to broaden our horizons and really think about everyone who should be able to play games. And if you don't like it, I get it. That's fine. But it ain't for you. And no one's forcing you to use it, nor does it invalidate the work you put in playing the game without streamlined progression to earn your trophies or fight bosses. I think this is just a cool, fun way for people to experiment with the game and jump on board and be able to play and just have fun. And there's a lot of cool streamlined progression stuff coming to Rebirth specifically. It's not just the always have maximum HP and MP and ATB bars. You now have full synergy. You'll have full maximum damage for things like mini games, which will make a lot of those mini games a lot easier to clean up. And even Naoki Hamaguchi had talked about in recent interviews that maybe they went a little too ham on some of the mini game stuff in Rebirth, and maybe they'll dial that back just a smidge for Part 3. So I think this is cool. In regards to the lighting, this is really sick because I'd say about a year ago, I think it was an interview with 4Gamer where Hamaguchi and Katase were interviewed about the PC port of Rebirth, and they were talking about all the changes that that version had, a lot of the improvements, a lot of the stuff they had learned in the porting process. And one of the big focuses was improving the lighting. And the interviewer asked them like, hey, do you have any plans to maybe try and find a way to take the lighting improvements on the PC side of things and bring them to the PlayStation 5? And Hamaguchi was like, that's something we'll look into. And no joke, literally like 1, maybe 2 months later, he did another interview where he's like, yeah, we're gonna do it. And granted, it took a minute, but eventually, yeah, these lighting upgrades are going to hit PS5, which I think is really, really cool. Some of these scenes within Rebirth on PC compared to PS5, it is a night and day difference. I think that the lighting just looks much more natural on the PC. It's much more flattering to the characters. There are still locations, obviously, like Corel Desert, where things look kind of scary, not the best, but since I've learned more about lighting and how difficult it actually is to light a video game, because you have to take into consideration everything. How is the lighting going to affect your characters, the landscape, the buildings, the enemies? Are there objects within the environment that would reflect the lighting? Are there water sources? So it's a very complicated thing. So I'm a little bit, nicer to the lighting crew in the Remake Trilogy, because I'm like, your job is really hard. Granted, obviously it could be better, but I get it. It's really difficult. But the fact that Hamaguchi and the team were like, hey, we should try to find a way to bring these lighting improvements that we have on PC over to the PS5 crowd, I think is really cool. And I really appreciate how transparent Hamaguchi and the team have actually been with the Remake Trilogy. And not just that, but Hamaguchi has really stressed, like he says in his tweet, that he wants to ensure that no matter where you play one of these games in the 7 Remake Trilogy, your experience with said game should not be severely compromised. They should be somewhat comparable. So the fact that Hamaguchi and the team were like, yeah, we got to find a way to bring these improvements to the PlayStation 5, and they actually did and kept that promise, I think is really exciting. And we're going to have to wait just a little bit longer for the lighting improvements to hit. That'll happen when Rebirth officially goes multi-platform. But I'm pretty excited to see how they perform on the PlayStation 5. I'm pretty sure, if possible, they will take those lighting improvements and already work them into the Switch 2 and Xbox version. So all of those should probably launch around the same date, I would assume. Now, speaking of transparency and making sure people have great experiences, Hamaguchi was recently interviewed by Automaton Media, which we did cover here on the channel, but since then they've been putting out smaller, slightly more detailed sections of that interview where Hamaguchi is able to elaborate a little bit more on some of the stuff they covered in that interview itself. And in this article, we're going to take a very brief look at, he talks a little bit more about why they chose to stay with Unreal Engine 4 instead of jumping ship to Unreal Engine 5. And some of this is stuff we have covered in previous videos, so it might be a little bit redundant, but he does add some new things. And he starts off first, and I'm just going to go ahead and summarize this for you guys. He does say that while Unreal 5 does have some interesting perks, including things like nanites and lumen, ultimately they've built so many tools and specifically graphical pipelines for this Remake Trilogy within Unreal Engine 4. And those tools allow them to not only optimize faster, but also port these games much easier. And if they were to jump ship to Unreal Engine 5, all of that stuff would have been reset and they would have had to start from scratch, which could have delayed the process of Part 3 by a ton. So by sticking with Unreal Engine 4, it just becomes a much more efficient development process for them, but also us, because we don't have to wait as long. And what's really interesting is in that article, they often bring up the misunderstanding that a lot of people have of, a new game engine means that it's automatically better than the previous one, or it's going to look better. And that's not always the case. I think an example I've used on this channel before is from NetherRealm Studios, the creators of the Mortal Kombat games. And up until, I believe, Mortal Kombat 11, they were still using Unreal Engine 3. I think it was like 3.5. So it's an incredibly old engine, but those games still looked and performed incredibly well. And I think NetherRealm and those games in particular are a really great example of how you can really stretch a game engine for years and years and years after it's already come out and people have already moved on to the next one. You can still squeeze a lot of power and technical prowess out of an engine like that if you know what you're doing. And he also continues to emphasize that everything that they've been learning so far throughout this development process, specifically with Rebirth, they're going to use towards Part 3 to make sure that the quality does not drop and that things can improve. So hopefully things like texture pop in eventually get solved. It's not a huge issue, but it's still one of those things that pops up and it's like, oh, a rock just showed up, this texture just showed up, or this tree, or these plants, but maybe that's, some of the technical know-how that they've found ways to hopefully fix on the console side of things. I know that's not really an issue on the PC. He also cites the fact that most of their staff from Remake to Rebirth didn't change, which we've covered in previous videos, and because they have a lot of the same people working on these games now, that creates a really great communication and chain of command for all of these people. Everyone knows what they need to do, they know how to do it, you don't really have to spend time training people or starting over. And Hamaguchi even joked that if they moved from Remake to Rebirth and he was told, okay, you got to build a new team, he's like, I don't think I can do this, this is impossible, which is funny, but also pretty true. And to go with the transparency aspect of Hamaguchi and the team's seemingly motto of this development cycle, he does tell people, you know, like, hey, like I want people to have good experiences, so don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we're in that day and age where you can kind of just message anybody. So, you know, don't be afraid to reach out if there's something that we missed. We would love to know. Because Hamaguchi has been very open in the past about accepting feedback, whether it's positive or negative. He looks at both of that stuff. And the interviewer does push back slightly by saying, well, you seem to have a bit of a resilient stance, which is kind of funny. But he goes, well, obviously, you know, please be gentle, which again, please be gentle. I've said this in prior videos, but how you voice your criticism is very, very important. If you go online and just harass developers and call them stupid, or they've ruined their game, they don't know what they're doing, this is cringe, this is awful, these developers are better than you, that's not going to help anybody. You got to be able to vocalize your concerns in a way where it's constructive and actually helpful. Again, like one of my biggest things has been the lighting. I think the lighting could be improved in this Remake trilogy specifically. There's obviously some pacing issues with the story and how in Remake and Rebirth they seemingly wait till like the last section of the game to really hit you with a lot of story stuff. There's still gameplay stuff that I think could be tweaked, like having materia loadouts and expanding more on the materia system and exploration changes. So there are genuine criticisms we all have, and it's just really important that you vocalize them in a way that's actually going to help these developers and not just make you seem like some weirdo grifter troll on the internet. That's not going to help anybody. So while some of that is info we've covered in the past, I just think it's really cool that Hamaguchi just, again, you know, elaborates like, hey, we're trying our best here. This is why we're doing what we're doing. He just wants people to know like, hey, like we're being honest here. And I appreciate it. Now, another thing that has me really, really excited that has to do with graphical fidelity and the lighting, and that is the PS5 Pro version of Rebirth, because it uses the PSSR technology, or pisser tech, as some people like to call it. And what that is a really cool upscaling tech that improves the visuals of a game, including its resolution, its frame rate, its overall performance, to ensure that the game can look and perform better. In theory. And I say in theory because some games actually perform way worse on the PlayStation 5 Pro with their Pro modes turned on. I think Silent Hill 2 Remake, for example, was a game that really struggled with the PS5 Pro, and I think some of that has to do with the engines that these games are built on as well. But Rebirth is a shining example of how the Pro, when done right, can actually make a game look and perform a lot better than its base version. The Pro version of Rebirth is probably still the best way to play this game. And granted, you can get the game looking better on PC, but because of PC architecture, that thing can be really confusing. And there are still a lot of people out there that are unable to get Rebirth running smoothly on their PCs. And I imagine trying to develop for PC, not easy, because you have to consider a multitude of different hardware combinations. And that's one of the reasons I personally just don't play games on my PC. I like the ability to have a console, I plug it in, I put the game in, it just works, it looks good. I don't have to worry about anything. FSR, VH1, MTV, I make those jokes a lot, but that's what it really kind of just sounds like to me. It's super complicated, and I don't really want to deal with that. So it sucks for the PC users who are still having issues. I hope that maybe they can find a way to really iron that stuff out. And it's just really inconsistent. Some people have problems. Some people run Rebirth just fine on their PC. Granted, you ideally want a situation where the game just runs fine for everybody. But I bring up PSSR because Sony is working on PSSR version 2, which, based on what they've been saying, is supposed to be a pretty big jump in terms of performance, and it's supposed to hit somewhere early this year. I don't think there's an actual release date just yet, but the reason I'm excited for that is because, again, Rebirth runs beautifully on the PS5 Pro. and it looks incredible. I can't imagine how much better Rebirth could look with PSSR version 2 enabled, and not just Rebirth, but 7 Remake Part 3. How much better could the visuals get? The lighting, the frame rate? Could I actually play at 4K 60 with ray tracing turned on, if that's a thing that they eventually end up doing? So this bodes very well for Rebirth, as well as Remake Part 3. So when PSSR version 2 does hit, I hope that Square Enix and Hamaguchi and the team consider revisiting Rebirth on the PS5 Pro and maybe release an updated patch to have it work properly with version 2 of PSSR. And again, 7 Remake Part 3 most likely would launch with a PSSR version 2 Pro patch right out of the box, which has me super excited because I just cannot wait to see what that game looks like visually. And I know from a technical perspective, it's going to be insane. Because again, when PS5 Pro patches are done right, games can look incredible. A recent example, and I have yet to get my hands on this because the game's not out yet, but a game like Resident Evil Requiem on the PlayStation 5 Pro is said to run at 4K 60 frames per second with ray tracing turned on. Now granted, that's Resident Evil. They're much smaller games, and RE Engine is a pretty incredible engine. So I think it's an engine by engine basis, but if that's what they are able to do at Capcom with that game, I can't imagine what Square and Hamaguchi and the team could do with Remake Part 3 on PSSR version 2. It's pretty exciting. Now, up next, we move over to a really interesting update headed to Ever Crisis to celebrate the 2.5-year anniversary event. And this is a brand new story event titled Weapon Showdown Battle for the Planet, where we're going to see Aerith and Sephiroth facing off against each other within the live stream. And the brief synopsis they gave is something along the lines of Sephiroth is using weapons to try and stop Aerith. Aerith, to protect her planet and her friends, is looking for a quote-unquote story to stop Sephiroth. So that part is a little weird, a little vague. I don't know if we're dealing with a childish young Sephiroth who needs a bedtime story. But I'm pretty excited to see how that turns out because it does have a lot of implications potentially on Remake Part 3. Now, not everything in Ever Crisis is canon, but some of it is. Specifically, the first soldier stuff we see with young Sephiroth, Glenn, Matt, Lucia, all of that stuff. Pretty consequential to the story of Sephiroth. And again, I'm sure they'll find ways to include all of the important bits in Part 3, so you don't actually have to go back and play through the first soldier to understand who Sephiroth is as a character in Part 3. But there's a lot of stuff to dissect here, and we start off first with the appearance of what seems to be the ultimate weapon from Final Fantasy VII, or Ultima Weapon as some people are referring to it as. Even in-game, in Ever Crisis, it's referred to as Ultima Weapon, so I don't know what's real anymore. Is this a Stein-Bears situation? Did I misremember? I have no idea. But a lot of people, including myself, we saw this in the trailer and we're like, hang on a second, that seems to be the ultimate weapon. Why are they spoiling the ultimate weapon? That's pretty messed up, right? Well, turns out, I don't think this is actually the ultimate weapon, because if you actually boot up Ever Crisis and you go into the event info, they describe this enemy as the Supreme Weapon Majeur, which I think is how it's pronounced. And it's going to be part of the escalation event where you can fight different enemies. And what's really interesting is that up until March 18th, they will be adding new enemies to that escalation event. So maybe we could see new weapons pop up in there. Maybe they'll just resort to using older enemies from Ever Crisis. I'm not quite sure, but that's pretty intriguing. Now you're probably wondering, well, why take a design of a Final Fantasy VII enemy and change the name? Well, that's something that Ever Crisis does pretty consistently, where they'll take an enemy from the OG FF7 or the Remake Trilogy, give it a reskin, change the name, boom, you got a new enemy, Bob's your uncle, go have some fun. And when it comes to Ever Crisis in particular, they tend to stick to the designs of the OG FF7's characters and enemies for the most part. They do take inspiration and assets from the Remake Trilogy, of course, but some of the stuff is, clearly designed to be as close to the original FF7 as possible, and I think that's what we're seeing here with this design. It's clearly looking like an ultimate weapon, but more in line with what it'll look like in the OG FF7 if you just grabbed it from that game and modernized it. So I would expect this weapon to look very different in Remake Part 3. Obviously, the visual fidelity will be better, but I think the overall design will be different as well. So I think this is less of a spoiler and more of a just like, hey, this is what OG Ultimate Weapon would look like in modern day, but we're just going to change the name because we're Ever Crisis and that's what we do. But also within the event info in Ever Crisis, they do say that you can compete and win the Ultima weapon ability Shadow Flare, and there's a picture of this creature, so it's kind of all over the place. But that leads to my next thought about the story and some of its implications on Part 3 that we could actually see within the story of that game. And if we look within the lore of Final Fantasy VII, Aerith and Sephiroth have technically been duking it out with one another within the live stream for quite some time. And if the Remake Trilogy ends up being confirmed as a sequel series, then technically those two have been battling for close to 30 years now, which is pretty exhausting just thinking about it. Now, we do seem to see bits of that battle within Remake and Rebirth because there are moments within that game's story where it seems like livestream Aerith is choosing to speak through our Aerith to confront Sephiroth, who could also be a livestream Sephiroth for all we know. And it usually happens within key points of the story where she confronts him. And we know that both Sephiroth and Aerith seemingly have completely different ideologies in how life and death should work. Based on what we've seen in Ever Crisis, Sephiroth could potentially want to create a world where life is eternal and nobody dies. He would still be the ruler, of course, but hey, you don't gotta go back to the live stream. And with Aerith, she is very much the opposite of that. She is someone who wants to keep that cycle of life continuing and allow people to pass on, enter the live stream, and rest. So aspects of that story and those, two characters battling with opposing ideologies could show up here in this Ever Crisis event, which again could just be like a sneak peek of what we see in Part 3. Another potential implication that is pretty exciting is Sephiroth's relationship to the weapons. And this is pretty cool, and this was brought up by the Shinra Archaeology Department over on Blue Sky, where I believe they were pulling from one of the old school FF7 Ultimania books. And within that book, it talks about Sephiroth potentially being able to exert some sort of influence or control over the weapons, because the weapons, once they emerge, they never fight or attack Sephiroth, and their whole goal is defending the planet, right? And Sephiroth, he's a pretty big threat to the planet. But I guess you could chalk it up to he was in the northern crater, he had a barrier around him, maybe the weapons decided other people were bigger threats, we don't really know. But the thought of Sephiroth potentially having influence over the weapons bleeds into this Ever Crisis event, because if Sephiroth is just straight up using weapons to stop Aerith, that's pretty cool. More implications for Part 3 story. Because it's possible that the weapons will now have a much bigger role and newer implications in the story of Part 3. And it's possible that maybe Sephiroth, once these weapons come out, is using them not just against the planet, but against the party. So that one there is a really cool mystery that I'm really intrigued by, is does Sephiroth have any control over the weapons? Which brings me to my final thought in regards to this event and Part 3 story implications, and that's the weapons that we see in Rebirth. Yes, they're smaller, they're more whale-like, they seem to have the Magnus materia within their chests, but whose side are they really on? It definitely seems like they're not on Sephiroth's side, since we see him outright attack them in Rebirth. We also see the Black Whispers try to stop them too, so I'm kind of under the belief that if Sephiroth has his own set of weapons, then maybe Aerith could have her own set of weapons, and maybe those whale-like weapons are the ones working with her, unless they're just working with the planet. But I kind of lean more towards Aerith's weapons, because these weapons do protect Tifa when she's in the live stream. They take her on the journey, little Sherpas, and it's pretty clear that Sephiroth does not like them and he wants to stop them. And what's cool is that these weapons are seemingly like one of the few beings we've seen within the world of the Remake Trilogy that actually gives Sephiroth some trouble. He can't just cut one of these things down. It's actually requiring some pretty strong effort on his part to do just a little bit of damage to one of these weapons. So it would make sense if he's trying to attack these guys, maybe they're working with Aerith. But that's all just speculation on my part. but it's pretty exciting. Again, this is a really cool, interesting event, and it's set to go live on February 28th, which is a little weird because that's a Saturday, and normally Ever Crisis does their events on Wednesdays. So if it's structured like other events, this should be a two-parter. So within the next few weeks, I should be able to recap it and, post that up here on the channel, and we can actually discuss how far they go with this event in terms of the story stuff and if it will affect part 3. Now, with that being said, that's the video. Now, some of you are probably thinking, that lighting information, that's old news, Corduroy. You're past your prime, you missed out on this one. Why did you come so late with this one? Well, I initially was planning to bundle a lot of this FF7 news with the Dirge of Cerberus finale and Ever Crisis, but that finale has not happened yet. It's been a really weird rollout for Dirge and Ever Crisis. It's a 3-part event. Parts 1 and 2 already took place. I thought for sure part 3 would have happened by now, but it hasn't. And there are 8 days left in the Dirge event, so I'm guessing the finale will be next week on a Wednesday. So if you're someone who's been waiting on my recap for that, apologies, but it's way out of my hands. But it's a little annoying. I just kind of wish the people handling Ever Crisis, at the start of each event would just put out like a calendar that lets players know, hey, these specific dates, that's when all the story stuff is going to happen. I would just really appreciate a heads up. It makes it a little bit easier for me as a content creator so I can prepare properly. But that's why I got to the lighting information way late because I was hoping and thinking I was going to be able to cover it much earlier than this. If you made it this far into the video, I would appreciate if you guys could click the like button, subscribe if you want to hear more, and hype up the video if you enjoyed it. I tried to keep my energy up for this video. I'm unfortunately on the recovering end of a pretty bad stomach bug, which messed me up. I went 2 days without eating or drinking anything because it was that bad. So I tried to boost my energy for this one to try and keep it interesting. And I am feeling better. I should be 100% tomorrow, maybe the day after, but man, stomach bugs are no joke. It was a miserable experience. But with that being said, I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on what we discussed in today's video, ranging from sales updates for Remake on Switch 2 and Xbox, some of the lighting improvements that are coming to Rebirth on PS5. Do you have any thoughts on PSSR version 2 and its effects on Rebirth and Remake Part 3? And what are you thinking so far on this Ever Crisis event, the ultimate weapon, not ultimate weapon, and some of those implications that this event might preview for Part 3? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.